Continuing Marcus Cato from Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Hugh Clough. Cato grew more and more powerful by his eloquence, so that he was commonly called the Roman Demosthenes, but his manner of life was yet more famous and talked of, for oratorical skill was an accomplishment commonly studied and sought after by all young men, but he was very rare who would cultivate the old habits of bodily labor, or prefer a light supper and a breakfast which never saw the fire, or be in love with poor clothes and a homely lodging, or could set his ambition rather on doing without luxuries than on possessing them. For now the state, unable to keep its purity by reason of its greatness, and having so many affairs and people from all parts under the government, was fain to admit many mixed customers and new examples of living. Now, a lack of perfection is not because there's just too much or something like that, or that there's different material cultures involved in such a state. Like, for example, my idea of theocracy I ascribe to, material culture isn't the thing. There's not a superior language. Perhaps there's a scripture revealed in the language and it's a superior text or something like that, but there's not the idea that the language itself is a superior thing, just the language of that book versus the others, But yeah, it's individuals that aren't doing their part of perfecting themselves, then that adds up and comes down on the government. All these people, communism, corporatism, capitalism, which one's fascism, socialism, which one's better? It's like they're all going to fail without, With reason, therefore, everybody admired Cato when they saw others sink under labors and grow effeminate by pleasures, and yet beheld him unconquered by either, and that not only when he was young and desirous of honor, but also when old and grey-headed, after a consulship and triumph, like some famous victor in the games, persevering in his exercise and maintaining his character to the very last. He himself says that he never wore a suit of clothes which cost more than 100 drachmas, and that when he was general and consul, he drank the same wine which his workmen did, and that the meat or fish which was brought into the meat market for his dinner did not cost above 30 donkeys. Well, I've figured maybe total, because 30 donkeys per meal, that's, what is he eating, all which was for the sake of the commonwealth, so that his body might be the hardier for the war. Having a piece of embroidered Babylonian tapestry left him, he sold it because none of his farmhouses were so much as plastered, nor did he ever buy a slave for above 1,500 drachmas, as he did not seek for effeminate and handsome ones, but able, sturdy workmen, horsekeepers, and cowherds, and these he thought ought to be sold again when they grew old, and no useless servants fed in the house. In short, he reckoned nothing a good bargain which was superfluous, but whatever it was, though sold for a farthing, he would take and think it a great price, if you had no need of it, and was for the purchase of lands for sowing and feeding, rather than grounds for sweeping and watering. Some imputed these things to petty avarice, but others approved of him as if he had only the more strictly denied himself for the rectifying and amending of others. Yet certainly, in my judgment, it marks an over-rigid temper for a man to take the work out of his servants as out of brute beasts, turning them off and selling them in their old age, and thinking there ought to be no further commerce between man and man, than whilst there arises some profit by it. We see that kindness or humanity has a larger field than bare justice to exercise itself in. Law and justice we cannot, in the nature of things, employ on others than men, but we may extend our goodness and charity even to irrational creatures, and such acts flow from a gentle nature as water from an abundant spring. It is doubtless the part of a kind-natured man to keep even worn-out horses and dogs, and not only take care of them when they are foals and whelps, when they are foals and whelps, but also when they are grown old. The Athenians, when they had built their hecatompedon, turned those mules loose to find freely which they had observed to have done the hardest labor. One of these, they say, came once of itself to offer its sacrifice, and ran along with nay, and went before the teams which drew the wagons up to the Acropolis, as if it would incite and encourage them to draw more stoutly, upon which there passed a vote that the creature should be kept at the public charge, even if till dead. The graves of Cimone's horses, which thrice won the Olympian races, are yet to be seen close by his own monument. Old Xanthopus, too, amongst many others who buried the dogs they had bred up, entombed his, which swam after his galley to Salamis, when the people fled from Athens, on the top of a cliff, which they call the dog's tomb to this day. Now are we to use living creatures like old shoes or dishes, and throw them away when they are worn out or broken with service? But if it were for nothing else but by way of study and practice in humanity, a man might always to pre-habituate himself in these things, to be of a kind and sweet disposition. As to myself, I would not so much as sell my draught, as on the account of his age, much less for a small piece of money, sell a poor man, and so chase him, as it were, from his own country, by turning him not only out of the place where he has lived a long while, but also out of the manner of living he has been accustomed to, and that more especially he would be as useless to the buyer as to the seller. Yet Cato for all this glories that he left that very horse in Spain, which he used in the wars when he was consul, only because he would not put the public to the charge of his fright. Whether these acts are to be ascribed to the greatness or pettiness of his spirit, let everyone argue as they please. For his general temperance, however, and self-control, he really deserves the highest admiration. For when he commanded the army, he never took for himself and those that belonged to him above 3 bushels of wheat for a month, and somewhat less than a bushel and half a day of barley for his baggage cattle. And when he entered upon the government of Sardinia, where his predecessors had been used to require tents, bedding, and clothes upon the public account, and to charge the state heavily with the cost of provisions and entertainments for a great train of servants and friends, the difference he showed in his economy was something incredible. There was nothing of any sort for which he put the public to expense. He would walk without a carriage to visit the cities, with only one of this common town officers, who carried his dress and a cup to offer libations with, Yet though he seemed thus easy and sparing to all who were under his power, he, on the other hand, showed most inflexible severity and strictness in what related to public justice, and was rigorous and precise to what concerned the ordinances of the commonwealth, so that the Roman government never seemed more terrible, nor yet more mild, than under his administration. His very manner of speaking seemed to have a kind of idea with it, for it was courteous and yet forcible, pleasant yet overwhelming, facetious yet austere, sententious yet vehement, like Socrates in the description of Plato, who seemed outwardly to those about him to be but a simple, talkative, blunt fellow, whilst at the bottom he was full of such gravity and matter as would even move tears and touch the very hearts of his auditors. And therefore I know not what has persuaded some to say that Cato's style was chiefly like that of Lysias. However, let us leave those to judge of those things who profess most to distinguish between the several kinds of oratorical style in Latin, whilst we write down some of his memorable sayings, being of the opinion that a man's character appears much more than by his words than, as some think it does, by his looks. Being once desirous to dissuade the common people of Rome from their unseasonable and impetuous clamor for largesses and distributions of corn. This means grain, excluding corn, because they didn't have corn. Just the language use is different, right? He began thus to harangue them. It is a difficult task, O citizens, to make speeches to the belly, which has no ears, reproving also their sumptuous habits. He said it was hard to preserve a city or a fish sold for more than an ox. He had a saying also that the Roman people were like sheep, for they when single do not obey, but when all together in a flock, they follow their leaders. So you, said he, when you have got together in a body, let yourselves be guided by those whom singly you would never think of being advised by. Discoursing of the power of women, men, said he, usually command women, but we command all men, and the women command us. But this indeed is borrowed from the sayings of Themistocles, who, when his son was making many demands of him by means of the mother, said, A woman, the Athenians govern the Greeks, I govern the Athenians. But you govern me, and your son governs you. So let him use his power sparingly, since simple as he is, he can do more than all the Greeks together. Another saying of Cato's was, that the Roman people did not only fix the value of such and such purple dyes, but also such and such habits of life. For, said he, as dyers most of all dye such colors as they see to be most agreeable, so the young men learn and zealously affect what is most popular with you. He also exhorted them out that, if they were grown great by their virtue and temperance, they should not change for the worse, but if intemperance and vice had made them great, they should change for the better, for by that means they were grown indeed quite great enough. He would say likewise of men who wanted to be continually in office, that apparently they did not know their road, since they could not do without beadless, there's no capital letter, so that's there's no second S, so it's not beadless. Beadless, you know, at last, without beads, but to guide them on it. He also reproved the citizens for choosing still the same men as their magistrates. For you will seem, said he, either not to esteem government worth much, or to think few worthy to hold it, speaking too of a certain enemy of his, who lived a very base and discreditable life. It is considered, he said, rather as a curse than a blessing on him that his fellow's mother prays that she may leave him behind her, pointing at one who had sold the land which his father had left him, and which lay near the seaside. He pretended to express his wonder at his being stronger than the sea itself, for what it washed away with a great deal of labor, he with a great deal of ease drank away. When the Senate with a great deal of splendor received King Eumenes on his visit to Rome, and the chief citizens strove who should be most about him, Cato appeared to regard him with suspicion and apprehension, when one that stood by too took occasion to say that he was a very good prince and a great lover of the Romans. It may be so, said Cato, but by nature this same animal of a king is a kind of man-eater. Nor indeed were there ever kings who deserved to be compared with Epaminondas, Pericles, Themistocles, Manius Curius, or Hamilcar, surnamed Barcas. He used to say, too, that his enemies envied him because he had to get up every day before light and neglect his own business to follow that of the public. He would also tell you that he had rather be deprived of the reward for doing well than not to suffer the punishment for doing ill, and that he could pardon all offenders but himself. The Romans having sent 3 ambassadors to Bithynia, of whom one was gouty, another had his skull trepanned, and the other seemed little better than a fool, Cato laughing gave out that the Romans had sent an embassy which had neither feet, head, nor heart, his interest being entreated by Scipio on account of Pelopius for the Achaean exiles, and there happening to be a great discussion in the Senate about it, some being for and some against their return, Cato standing up, thus delivering himself. Here do we sit all day long, as if we had nothing to do but beat our brains whether these old Greeks should be carried to their graves by the bearers here or by those in Achaia. The Senate voting to return, it seems that a few days after Polybius's friends further wished that it should be further moved in the Senate that the said banished persons should receive again the honors which they first had in Achaia, and to this purpose they sounded Cato for his opinion. But he, smiling, answered that Polybius, Ulysses alike, having escaped out of the Cyclops' den, wanted, it would seem, to go back again because he had left his cap and belt behind him. He used to assert also that wise men profited more by fools than fools by wise men, for that wise men avoided the faults of fools but that fools would not imitate the good examples of wise men. He would profess too that he was more taken with young men that blushed than with those who looked pale, and that he never desired to have a soldier that moved his hands too much in marching, and his feet too much in fighting, or snored louder than he shouted, ridiculing a fat overgrown man. What use, said he, can the state turn a man's body to, when all between the throat and the groin is taken up by the belly? When one who was much given to pleasures desired his acquaintance, begging his pardon, he said he could not live with a man whose palate was of a quicker sense than his heart. He would likewise say that the soul of a lover lived in the body of another, and that in his whole life he most repented of three things. One was that he had trusted a secret to a woman, another that he went by water when he might have gone by land, the third that he had remained one whole day without doing any business of moment, applying himself to an old man who was committing some vice. Friend, said he, old age has of itself blemishes enough. Do not you add to it the deformity of vice. Speaking to a tribune who was reputed a poisoner, and was very violent for the bringing in of a bill in order to make a certain law, young man, cried he, I know not which would be better, to drink what you mix, or confirm what you would put up for a law. Being reviled by a fellow who lived a profligate and wicked life, a contest, replied he, is unequal between you and me, for you can hear ill words easily, and can as easily give them, but it is unpleasant to me to give such, and unusual to hear them. Such was his manner of expressing himself in his memorable sayings. Being chosen consul with his friend and familiar Valerius Flaccus, the government of that part of Spain which the Romans call the Hither, Spain fell to his lot. Here, as he was engaged in reducing some of the tribes by force and bringing over others by good words, a large army of the barbarians, they didn't understand their language, fell upon him, so that there was danger of being disgracefully forced out again. He therefore called upon his neighbors, the Celtiberians, for help, and on their demanding 200 talents for their assistance, everybody else thought it intolerable that even the Romans should promise barbarians a reward for their aid. But Cato said that there was no discredit or harm in it, for if they overcame, they would pay them out of the enemy's purse, and not out of their own. But if they were overcome, there would be nobody left either to demand the reward or to pay it. However, he won that battle completely, and after that, all his other affairs succeeded splendidly. Polybius says that, by his command, the walls of all the cities on this side the river Batis were in one day's time demolished, and yet there were a great many of them full of brave and warlike men. Cato himself says that he took more cities than he stayed days in Spain. Neither is this a mere rhodomontade, if it be true that the number was 400, and though the soldiers themselves had got much in the fights, yet he distributed a pound of silver to every man of them, saying it was better that many of the Romans should return home with silver rather than a few with gold. For himself he affirms that of all the things that were taken, none came to him beyond what he ate and drank. Neither do I find fault, continued he, with those that seek to profit by these spoils, but I had rather compete in valor with the best than in wealth with the richest, or with the most covetous in love of money. Nor did he merely keep himself clear from taking anything, but even all those who more immediately belonged to them. He had 5 servants with him in the army, one of whom was called Pacus, bought 3 boys out of those who were taken captive, which Cato, coming to understand, the man, rather than venture into his presence, hanged himself. Cato sold the boys and carried the price he got for them into the public exchequer. And all these people killing themselves and sacrifices is like, no, wait and see, and I don't know if you're gonna be executed anyways. Why, why not let them do the deed and let them bear the responsibility, right? Scipio the Great, being his enemy and desiring, whilst he was carrying all these things so successfully, to obstruct him and take the affairs of Spain in his own hands, succeeding in getting himself appointed his successor in the government, and, making all possible haste, put a term to Cato's authority. But he, taking with him a convoy of 5 cohorts of food, of foot and 500 horse, to attend him home, overthrew by the way the Lacatanians, and, taking from them 600 deserters, caused them all to be beheaded, upon which Scipio seemed to be in indignation, but Cato, in mock disparagement of himself, said Rome would become great indeed if the most honorable and great men would not yield up the first place of valor to those who were more obscure, and when they who were of the commonalty, as he himself was, would contend in valor with those who were most eminent in birth and honor. The Senate having voted to change nothing of what had been established by Cato, the government passed away under Scipio to no manner of purpose, in idleness and doing nothing, and so diminished his credit much more than Cato's. Nor did Cato, who now received a triumph, remit after this, and slacken the reins of virtue, as many do, who strive not so much for virtue's sake as for vainglory in having attained the highest honors, as the consulship and triumphs, pass the rest of their life in pleasure and idleness, and quit all public affairs. But he, like those who just entered upon public life for the first time, and thirst after gaining honor and glory in some new office, strained himself as if he were but just setting out, and offering still publicly his service to his friends and citizens, would give up neither his pleadings nor his soldiery. He accompanied and assisted Tiberius Sempronius as his lieutenant when he went into Thrace and to the Danube, and in the quality of tribune went with Manius Achilles into Greece against Antiochus the Great, who, after Hannibal, more than any one struck terror into the Romans, for having reduced once more under a single command almost the whole of Asia, not really the same as the continent, right? All, namely, that Seleucus, Icator, had possessed, and having brought into obedience many warlike nations of the barbarians, he longed to fall by the Romans, as if they were only now worthy to fight with him. So across he came with his forces, pretending as a specious cause of the war, that it was to free the Greeks, who had indeed no need of it, they having been but newly delivered from the power of King Philip and the Macedonians, and made independent with the free use of their own laws by the goodness of the Romans themselves, so that all Greece was in commotion and excitement, having been corrupted by the hopes of royal aid, which the popular leaders in their cities put them into. Manius therefore sent ambassadors to the different cities, and Titus Flaminius, as is written in the account of him, suppressed and quieted most of the attempts of the innovators without any trouble. Cato brought over the Corinthians, those of Petra and Agium, and spent a good deal of time at Athens. There is also an oration of his said to be extant, which he spake in Greek to the people, in which he expressed his admiration of the virtue of the ancient Athenians, and signified that he came with a great deal of pleasure to be a spectator of the beauty and greatness of their city. But this is a fiction, for he spoke to the Athenians by an interpreter, though he was able to have spoken himself, but he wished to observe the usage of his own country, and laughed at those who admired nothing but what was in Greek, jesting upon Postumius Labienus, who had written an historical work in Greek, and requested that allowances might be made for his attempt. He said that allowance indeed might be made if he had done it under the express compulsion of an Amphictyonic decree. The Athenians, he says, admired the quickness and vehemence of his speech, for an interpreter would be very long in repeating what he expressed with a great deal of brevity, but on the whole he professed to believe that the words of the Greeks came only from their lips, whilst those of the Romans came from their hearts. Now Antiochus, having occupied his army with the narrow passages about Thermopylae, and added palisades and walls to the natural fortifications of the place, sat down there, thinking he had done enough to divert the war, and the Romans indeed seemed wholly to despair of forcing the passage. But Cato, calling to mind the compass and circuit which the Persians had formerly made to come at this place, went forth in the night, taking along with him partly of the army. Now, one of the things is that what's in another language, the heart's not there for you. You know, it's not your native language. Maybe you don't even speak it. But there are some differences how emotional people get with what they're saying. But a tendency is not the same as every individual if you don't know about the individual, you know. Whilst they were climbing up, the guide, who was a prisoner, missed the way, and wandering up and down by impracticable and precipitous paths, filled the soldiers with fear and despondency. Cato, perceiving the danger, commanded all the rest to halt and stay where they were, whilst he himself, taking along with him one Lucius Manlius, a most expert man in climbing mountains, went forward with a great deal of labor and danger, in the dark night, and without the least moonshine, among the wild olive trees and steep craggy rocks, there being nothing but precipices and darkness before their eyes, so they struck into a light pass, which they thought might lead down into the enemy's camp. Ere they passed, up marks upon some conspicuous peaks which surmount the hill called Caledramon, and returning again, they led the army along with them to the said marks, till they got into their little path again, and there once made a halt. But when they began to go further, the path deserted them at a precipice, where they were in another strait and fear, nor did they perceive that they were all this while near the enemy. And now the day began to give some light, when they seemed to hear a noise, and presently after to see the Greek trenches and guard at the foot of the rock. Here, therefore, Cato halted his forces and commanded the troops from Firmum only, without the rest, to stick by him, as he had always found them faithful and ready. And when they came up and formed around him in close order, he thus spoke to them. I desire, he said, to take one of the enemy alive, so that I may understand what men these are who guard the passage, their number, and what discipline, order, and preparation they expect us. But this feat, continued he, must be an act of a great deal of quickness and boldness, such as that of lions when they dart upon some timorous animal. Cato had no sooner thus expressed himself, but the Firmans forthwith rushed down the mountain, just as they were, upon the guard, and, falling unexpectedly upon them, affrighted and dispersed them all. One armed man they took and brought to Cato, who quickly learned from him that the rest of the forces lay in the narrow passage about the king, and that those who kept the tops of the rocks were 600 choice Attalians. Cato, therefore, despising the smallness of their number and carelessness, forthwith, drawing his sword, fell upon them with a great noise of trumpets and shouting. The enemy, perceiving them thus, tumbling, as it were, upon them from the precipices, flew to the main body, and put all things into disorder there. In the meantime, whilst Manius was forcing the works below, and pouring the thickest of his forces into the narrow passages, Antiochus was hit in the mouth with a stone, so that his teeth being beaten out of it, he felt such excessive pain that he was fain to turn away with his horse. Nor did any part of his army stand the shock of the Romans, yet, though there seemed no reasonable hope of flight, where all paths were so difficult, and where there were deep marshes and steep rocks, which looked as if they were ready to receive those who should stumble, the fugitives, nevertheless, crowding and pressing together in the narrow passages, destroyed even one another in their terror of the swords and blows of the enemy. Cato, as it were, as it plainly appears, was never oversparing of his own praises, and seldom shunned boasting of any exploit, which equally indeed he seems to have thought the natural accomplishment of great actions, and with these particular exploits he was highly puffed up. He says that those who saw him that day pursuing and slaying the enemies, ready to assert that Cato owed not so much to the public as the public did to Cato. Nay, he adds that Manius the consul, coming hot from the